Hi, and welcome to Unprecedented Journey. I'm your host, Jeff Oppenheim, and I thank you for joining me today. Today's show really is a bit of a fork in the road for us programmatically, in that, well, although I've covered a lot of different topics and you've met a lot of different experts through this show, there are two topics in particular that I've more or less steered clear of. I refer, of course, to politics and religion. Now, before you click off of this show and go to another YouTube video, something much lighter or anything like that, I'd like you to stay put because we're still going to go at that. These two topics in a very unprecedented fashion. And I really felt we should cover these right now because, of course, we're in the midst of the election already. It has begun, early voting in many different states. And, well, it's time for us to look at it as well. And particularly this election where both religion and politics are really at the crosshairs of the election. Now, I could think of no one better to invite to the show today than a professional colleague, friend of mine. He is a source for me off the set as well when I prepare for different subject matters unrelated to this show. His name is Lew Nescott Jr. Now, Lew has a deep knowledge in both of these areas, and that's why I really wanted to bring him on board. And in addition, Lew and I are going to be traveling down to DC together this week, in fact, and we're going to be meeting with a variety of religious leaders and political leaders and talking to them in particular how this year, this election, the 2020 election, we find religion and politics ever the more at the crossroads at the election, at the ballot box. So let me introduce you now to Lew Nescott Jr. Lew, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Lew, I'm going to jump right in here because, and in saying that, we're also going to be violating the polite society rules of never talk about politics and religion at the dinner table.
You never sat around my family's dinner table. That was the only thing to talk about.
That was the only
So make dinner worthwhile.
Certainly develops an appetite or forces one to lose one.
Yeah, and along with developing good lines of argument to make a case, defend yourself, eat later, defend yourself, make a point.
Well, I want to roll back a little bit and ask you how these two topics entered your life.
Before the dinner table, when I was born and raised in a small steel town outside Pittsburgh, right? And faith and politics, without apology, were central to my family's life. My grandfather, who I never met, my mom's dad, was a Russian Orthodox Christian priest, right? And priests in the Orthodox Christian tradition can marry and have families. So immediately, right from the get-go, my mom was bringing to the table her view of the faith. My dad, his dad emigrated from Poland, the turn of the last century, worked his way across Pennsylvania from a coal miner carrying a canary down to the mine, which my dad used to call blood money, all the way to Pittsburgh and the area, and settled into Nora, Pennsylvania, where he worked the mills for a number of years, and after that opened a bar, but that's another story. But the point is that he saved his money to not only educate kids, but he saved his money to build a local church. So the oral history I got as a kid is that faith is central. After World War II, certainly politics was an avenue for many for involvement, right? And my dad, who was starting his law practice at the time, ran for state senate, was a Democrat, right? A centrist Democrat. And so immediately in my home, you would see pictures of icons and hear discussions about local politics, ward level, right? Into the weeds. So yeah, you get it as a kid. You don't understand what you're hearing, but it's like learning a language. You're getting it at an early age. So then I would have to say it's my background in home life, which gave me the foundation that you don't avoid those two topics. They're central to your identity and how you behave and respond in the world.
Well, on the same token, I have to imagine that this kind of upbringing, if you would either cause, and probably cause most young people to run from it screaming. But in your case, it caused you to embrace it ever the more. Let's talk about that.
You know, it's interesting. But before that, I ended up going to Yale Divinity School. But what got me there were a number of things. I mean, I was an altar boy in my church, right? And so the attraction as a kid of the sensory experience of incense, stained glass windows, the hymns, the celebration of the church calendar is how I very much bought into and adopted to this very day my image of what the church is, at least on a sensory level, right? And at one point, thought I might join the priesthood, which made my mom very happy. But I didn't go down that career path, and I'm not sure why. I was 18, and you discover other things at 18. But that stuck with me, so that after undergraduate work and spending a year working in international trade, doing direct reverse investment, working with the direct reverse investment program where you try to get foreign capital to invest in the state. Time I was working in Ohio. My wife was in graduate school. I decided to go to Yale Divinity School, which accepted me, God bless them, with the expectation that I might pursue an academic career. But at the end of the day, I realized two things. First, after a few years, I would run out of money, and secondly of all, I would run out of intelligence. I wasn't as bright as the people that teach for a living. So I was honored to be there. It was a big deal for me, a kid from a small steel town who didn't have the most stellar academic career in high school and so forth, to even set foot on Yale's campus, right? For me, it was very much a sacred moment and a special moment and an opportunity to learn, which I think is critical. So yeah, that sort of is the academic journey, I guess.
Well, so much about religion and the various houses of worship are very much about familiarity, I think, in the immigrant's life in particular. How did that represent your family experience?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you find yourself a stranger in a strange land, thousands of miles from home, without apology, it makes perfect sense. You would naturally gravitate to the community who might have emigrated with you. Why? Because it makes sense. Becoming, identifying work opportunities, right? Sharing cultural relations, right? On a religious or a social level, right? The holidays, the food, the language, all of that on the street lives, very much so, and it's there. So my community was, I guess you could say, ethnic in that way, but we were also encouraged to go out into the world, right, and to assimilate into the American experience.
Well, how do you think this common grounding then goes on to really solidify a national perspective, if you would?
We talk about religion and politics, right? And if, it strikes me that two things. The major policy questions, for example, in this country, that deal with big issues, war and peace, right? Economic development and economic fairness and income, right? Equality, questions of education and the availability of education, right? Election season, people talk about the middle class dream, right? All those kinds of things. Those are big policy questions with an undercurrent about really trying to do the right thing. At least that's the argument that's made. And if you really tease that out further, I think what you'll find doing the right thing many times is guided by a moral imperative, sometimes, not always, rooted in a religious imperative, right? So it's kind of like pulling up and just looking at, peeling the layers of an onion, right? So the point is that if you peel far enough, you'll see sometimes a religious impulse to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the imprisoned. Wow, does that manifest itself, in U.S. policy, domestic policy as an example, right? You talk about unprecedented journeys. We're all on an unprecedented journey. No human being ever created will never see another. Whether it's in this country and you live to a ripe old age of 101, or you're a child that never makes it to the first birthday, but you happen to have been born in a country in the midst of civil war, extreme poverty. But the point is that every life in that way is valued as unique and unprecedented. It's just that we can't wrap our hands around that, our head around it, because it's a hard thing to do, right? So, when you look at religion and politics, for example, on a personal level, right? Not the policy level, the society we live in, the government we live under, but at personal level, the relationships we make, the relationships we keep, the relationships we break. All of those things, the families made, right, and the friendships made, also tend to be guided by, to some extent, religion, and maybe a similar political point of view, right, about how we live in this society, right? So you find politics and religion intersecting, whether we like it or not.
Well, just as likely it can be a place of departure or even division, not only between friends and colleagues, but of course family members.
Of course, wedge issues, right? You're right. I mean, it's interesting. We can talk about faith and prayer, the manifestation of faith in words and song, right? And we always like to think of those things as being sources of comfort, the sacred, the divine, in a moment of crisis or comfort, or in preparation for a global event such as, a war that you find yourself in the middle of, right? The D-Day invasion, right? And the Second World War. So we think of prayer and faith in that way, but sometimes they can be used as a hammer, right? They can be used as a sword on both a political level and a personal level, right? One of the messages I got when I was a kid, for example, in the 60s growing up, is that people in my tradition didn't marry outside of the tradition. You just didn't. It was inconceivable. You can't. You shouldn't. You can bring somebody in, which is okay, fine, but you don't marry outside. We just don't do that, right? Thankfully, things have evolved as leadership on in this case, a clerical level has matured and evolved and become, if you will, more integrated into the American experience and understands the challenges faced by us all and has relaxed some of those extreme measures. But faith, you're absolutely right. Faith can be used as a hammer, and certainly in this political season, it's used in a way that I haven't seen in years.
Well, again, let me harken back to you and your journey, which is how has this upbringing of yours in many ways informed and helped you push further and deeper into politics and religion as a career path?
Yeah, it's interesting. Before 9/11, I had a comfortable job at a major university, and after 9/11, I wanted to do something, right? And you don't have to be a New Yorker to feel that. There are people across the globe that wanted to do something. And I didn't know what that something was. So when I could, I left my university job when the timing was right, and I had a core skill set, a research core skill set that the Department of Defense valued. And so as a contractor, I went downrange to Helmand Province, Afghanistan, which is in southern Afghanistan, the heart of poppy country, most of the world's opium and heroin still comes from there. So whether there is a war or not, it is still a supplier of heroin to the world to this very day. So I went downrange.
Let me just call out that language there, especially from a civilian point of view. You said downrange. Explain that.
Yeah, that means you go to a foreign country. Right. So I would, when I went to Afghanistan, right, I went to southern Afghanistan. It was a very kinetic, which is to say violent area. It was during the surge of 2010, 2011. Forget the movies. No, I wasn't that guy. But I did work in a program that gathered atmospheric information about how people felt about the main government in Kabul, and about the current U.S. effort there on the military front, and the effort at the same time to rebuild southern Afghanistan, bring some level of stability while ejecting the Taliban that desired absolutely no peace with Kabul, and certainly the Taliban elements that were harboring and still had a close relationship with the Qaeda organization. So the point is that being in that country, right, for me was a way in which I could serve. But what I realized is that the war on terror and our adversaries, because of where it was based, couched it and branded it in decidedly religious terms.
Well, as you're talking about a region where religion and politics are so deeply intertwined, it's sometimes hard to determine one from the other.
As other scholars have pointed out here in the United States, who study the Middle East, North Africa landscape on both a religious and political level, because you can't separate the two, right? It's a false distinction. You just don't. The two are very much, they're in play. So in southern Afghanistan, for example, if a Marine, dismounted Marine, that means on foot patrol unit, went into a city like Marja, which was in southern Afghanistan, 2010, 2011, they're walking through compounds and homes, and if they encounter Taliban fighters, their orders are to target and kill. That's the mission. But at the same time, to build what they could in terms of consensus with the community there, the local populace, right? Which is almost seemingly an impossible task to be a war fighter and a diplomat, and you're asking a 20 or 18-year-old kid to do that. But it's done, and it has to be done. But the compounds they would pass through there was no distinction between faith and the government or how people lived, right? So there would be calls for prayer, ideally 5 times a day, right? And how you process that, right? You're stepping into an environment that's decidedly religious, and you're fighting a war in that environment since 9/11. That, I think, has been the challenge, at least, to try to fight the war and always distinguish between, clearly, the adversaries and the nations where we are present, right?
Well, it's profound.
Wow.
And I think it begs reminding folks that the experience in this region of outsiders, and of course now our armed forces, well predates 9/11, certainly, right? I mean, one could say it's historical.
Americans are ahistoric, right? I mean, we tend to think of, oh my God, 100 years, and to me that's nothing. I tend to think in millennia. Why? Because we have to, if we want to gain a greater appreciation about where we came from, talk about an unprecedented journey that goes way back and where we might go, right? So you need to think about it in that way. And in the case of Afghanistan, where I was in 2010, 2011, you're absolutely right. It is, you don't think of it as a country in the traditional Western way, right? It's tribal. And the tribes will buy into a central government that provides humanitarian relief when essential, might protect the borders, right? But that's it. Pashtunwali and Afghan law kick into place, so there's nothing resembling federal law, right? And Afghanistan, when it works, accepts the fact that it is a collection of tribes, and the only role for a central government is to protect borders and provide humanitarian aid, right? But that is in the greater context of faith and religion and prayer.
Well, therein lies the conundrum, doesn't it? I mean, we're over there at what best can be described as political responsiveness, maybe diplomatic, or if we stretch it even more, humanitarian effort. But what we're encountering over there is sort of 2 factions that we don't really understand, right? One is that it is deeply tribal, again, something we don't know about, and profoundly, devoutly religious. Are we equipped, are our young men and women equipped to understand that and handle that?
And that, I think, has been a challenge for diplomats to navigate politically and effectively while we're conducting war on your soil. We do not mean to offend you on a religious level, right? Because this, for us, is very much a secular fight that happens to be taking place in your country, which is at core religious, right? And that's also a challenge for military commanders as well.
Well, that's a lot to ask a young foot soldier, isn't it? Especially one that might not even have much more than a high school education.
Right.
But I'm wondering, on a larger scale as a general populace, do we have a time in America, including now, where we are seeing this convergence on such a deep level of political rhetoric with religious rhetoric or doctrine?
That's a great question, because the wall as Thomas Jefferson said, or at least I believe used the word wall, the separation between church and state in his first inaugural in 1800, I think. He referenced that, right? Because when our republic was founded, right, they were founded by maybe, but probably funded, but also founded by sons of the Enlightenment, right, who were pushing back against monarchical rule, who were pushing against an official state religion, right, Church of England and so forth. So it made sense that the founders are essentially fleeing for their lives as refugees in this new land who decided to say, okay, let's create this country, this new experiment called the United States of America. Were sensitive to always pushing back, I think. But they couldn't do it entirely, right? Because I think there's a part of it that regardless, you can have the legal distinctions as we do in this country, but it's ingrained in our DNA, which goes beyond country or constitution. Now, you referenced the 2020 election currently, right now, and the tone of it. I would tend to agree. In my lifetime, and I've seen a few elections since 1972, I don't remember. And of course, the way of how the fight is conducted, right? It's done differently on social media, and God, traditional media almost looks tame by comparison. But nevertheless, regardless of the information platform, I've never seen anything like this in terms of the intensity of the political and religious rhetoric to get at least on one side a candidate elected, and it's prompted the other side to certainly put out a message that's very faith-based. So I've never seen it. Now, does it mean it's unprecedented? Unprecedented journey refers to every human life, right? That's unprecedented, right? But sometimes we can see, even in our own history, examples, right? Thomas Jefferson in 1800, when he was elected, inaugurated in 1801, between 1800 and 1803, there was some criticism of him on a religious level, right? Now, so keep in mind that people currently living in this new country were used to the idea of a state, if you will, church, right? So Virginia had a state church. I think the Anglican Church, which Jefferson was responsible for pulling support from, right? But nevertheless, there was pushback, and there was some criticism among clergy of Thomas Jefferson along the lines that he resists the Trinitarian notion of Christian interpretation, right? He rejects the divinity of Christ, right? So he was being, in many ways, in certain quarters, questioned about his religious beliefs. And this is 1800 to 1803, before the second election, his re-election campaign in 1804. So Jefferson begins to write in 1803 or 1804 what's called the Jefferson Bible, right? Where he was so bothered by it, it prompted him, this is as president of the United States, sitting president, to take a copy of the New Testament and literally, perhaps with a razor, so legend goes, cut out parts of the New Testament that he agreed with. I mean, cherry picking, right? And I think on one side it was Greek, the other side it was Latin. And he left out of his version of the Bible the divinity of Jesus, right? The miracles, the miraculous part, right? The healing of the blind and the deaf and the lame, right? That he left out. But what you're left with is his version in the Christian tradition, Jesus as a moral philosopher. Now, why did Jefferson do this? We could argue about why, but it was certainly an exercise as a sitting president for him, why he would even take the time, right? He felt challenged by the criticism, right, from the outside in the midst of a re-election campaign coming up in 1804. So Jefferson is doing this privately. And it really wasn't published, I think, until around 1820. And if you ever get a chance, go to the Smithsonian in Washington, where I think they have a copy of the Jefferson Bible, his cut and paste Cliff Notes version, where a sitting president in private felt challenged enough to interrogate himself about, what do I really believe? It's stunning, right? Now, so politics and religion is nothing new. It's just that this is being used, as I mentioned before, as a sword or a hammer for votes.
Particularly right now.
particularly right now. I mean, honestly, in the battleground states, right, if we look at Pennsylvania, for example, and Florida, Pennsylvania has a very large traditional Catholic voting population and an evangelical population. Florida has a very faithful evangelical and very large Catholic population, certainly, with ethnic roots, the Latinx population, certainly, which still attends and subscribes to the Catholic faith, the believers, right, including questions surrounding life at conception. It's not a question for many. And so that is a segue into, I think, how people might, or gives you a window and a glimpse into how people might vote, right? So the question is, will religion, particularly the large evangelical and ethnic Catholic populations in either Pennsylvania or Florida will Pennsylvania be the Florida of 2020, or will Florida be the Florida of 2020, right? Because if it's a big if, but if we do have an election, as some people still suspect we might have, right? And we're in the middle of an election, right? The last day of voting is no longer election day, it's November 3rd, right? Then it could be interesting. And make no mistake, faith is a part of it. On the ads themselves, the Trump campaign certainly has a stable of faith-based advisors, right? And they're reaching out certainly on the new, on the standard life at conception question.
Yes,
right?
but of course that's been a standard axiom of the past, hasn't it? Past elections, either being used and deployed Roe v. Wade to court the conservative Republican side, which is not all Republicans, of course, or to court the Democratic liberal side, which even amongst their ranks may have division.
But here's the thing we need to pay attention to, right? In the aftermath of the George Floyd killing in late May, nationwide protests with some attendant violence, tragically and sadly so, right? Washington, D.C. had its share of protest and anger and some violence, which included an attempted bombing of St. John's Episcopal Church across from Lafayette Square. If you've ever been to Washington,
which is where we're going.
Which is where we're going. The Church of the Presidents typically is where presidents go on Inauguration Day, right? And every president, including the current sitting president, Trump, I think, has gone there on their Inauguration Day. So it holds special interest. It's called Church of the Presidents, right? There was a firebomb. Their basement was firebombed. So on the afternoon of June 1st, a mix of federal forces with tear gas, stun grenades, and batons cleared the crowd from Lafayette Square. So, as everybody well knows, the well-documented photo op for President Trump, who walked from the White House with his Attorney General and attendant military personnel, including, I believe, the Joint Chiefs, to stand on the steps of the Church of the Presidents, where we're going, St. John's Episcopal Church, to hold up a Bible, right? And the President called it a photo op that most, quote, religious leaders love. So here's the question. Did the Republican Party at that point in time see an opportunity to move the faith-based appeal beyond the question of abortion or life at conception to now include law and order? If you're a faithful person, law and order. Look, they're burning churches, right? And they're coming for yours. And by extension, race. Right. So, I mean, it's a question. It's a question. And so the question, I think, for Republican operatives, was that an opportunity for them?
I'm going to ask you a bit of a jaded question here, right? With your Intel background and training, if your assignment was, say, America, election 2020, what would you say some of your quick field observations are, and how would you report back strategically?
Tremendous opportunities for us to exploit the government and the people at this point. We're all in the middle of a pandemic, and the Americans are dealing with a pandemic as well. They have politicized certain features of the pandemic which we need to exploit. And I'll tell you how to do that, as an intel officer might suggest. And we also need to use more traditional ways to challenge America right now. For example, if I was working Kagava KGB, right? The reconfigured KGB, and I was a Russian intel officer, I certainly would be out there buying as many bogus right now until the last day of voting on November 3rd and beyond, Facebook ads and Twitter ads, as many as I could buy that would tend to stoke, right, racial tension, with the George Floyd killing and Breonna Taylor, as well as tension over the mask, political tension, right? I would use the most extreme emotional language I could find, and I would use images that would lock people in, right? And I would throw in faith as well. Because that seems to be a driver for the Americans. So yeah, somewhere in all of this we need to exploit the tinderbox of religion and politics, because make no mistake, the Americans seem to be at each other's throats over it. Let me give you a quick footnote to this, and sorry to drone on here.
Well, just a point of clarification here, Lew, and I don't mean to be putting words in your mouth, but from what I'm hearing, especially from someone like you with Intel training and background, what I think I hear you saying is this is sort of a perfect maelstrom, if you would, for confusion and divisionism and perfect chaos, if you would, that could be used against us by an outside aggressor. Yes?
Well, I mean, I don't know what standard playbook. I want to get beyond the Jack Ryan cartoon character. I wasn't that guy. I was a contractor, okay, for the Department of Defense and the State Department. Kept my head down, lived in my cube, and worked the shifts that I needed to work and focused on the areas where I was asked to focus, right? So I need to be careful about that. I wasn't an operator out there, or the American, view of what the intel community looks like, because somebody in Hollywood decides what it looks like. That's the furthest from the truth it is. I'm all for as much transparency as possible, but not making the IC into simply an entertainment consultant for Hollywood. Let me go back to your point about what other information I might bring back, right, and how I might exploit it. I mentioned the traditional part, right? So I do think our forces need to be in high ready position in the South China Sea, the Middle East, North Africa region, in the Strait of Hormuz. What was a hot spot before the pandemic is still a hot spot. And if you think, for example, as an example, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, who ran covert operations like the number 3 guy, right, in Iran, killed in a drone strike authorized by this president, along with his chief of operations who ran operations in Iraq. If you think that somehow this is over, it ain't. Because it's a long game that's being played here. So from a national security point of view, this is where we live right now, and this is the world we have to navigate. As a footnote, you are navigating in a world, and with countries like Iran, and let's say their name fully, the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? The Royal Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, right? And all of these places where we are engaged. You are having to navigate not just a diplomatic or a military world, but a world of faith. Right? And it's there, and it's not going to go away. So again, religion and politics, outside of the contentious and tone that we find on using faith to garner votes, including both sides, but done in a different sort of way, I think on the Biden side, is playing out as a direct challenge to us, I think, overseas.
Well, as we talk about this cross-section of politics and religion, and we're talking about it calmly and having a conversation, I have to say what I think we're all inundated by at this point is a lot of noise, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of divisionism coming from both sides, from everything from the sublimely ridiculous QAnon to the Lincoln Project, which is so interesting to watch deep Republicans flip to the other side, right?
I'm not going judge it. I'll just tell you what I see. So, and America sees this, or a portion of it anyway. For example, the Lincoln Project, which is comprised of former high-level Republican operatives. I shouldn't say former. They're probably right now frustrated Republican operatives, headed by Steve Schmidt and Kellyanne Conway's husband and others, prominent people, are in a, how should I say, I won't call it anti-Trump, but they are certainly not for the re-election of Donald Trump. So the Lincoln Project was founded, and they run very effective ads. These are the same people that developed Ronald Reagan's famous Morning in America ad, right? Where Morning in America talked about it was a positive ad about how interest rates are low, and in any given day X number of people are getting married and getting mortgages, and isn't this wonderful? And they show churches, and and they show firemen shining fire trucks, and this is America, and isn't everything right in America in 1980? Why would you want to change? Well, the same people that gave you 1980 Morning in America gave you 2020 Morning in America, MOURNIG, and encourage everybody to get on and look at their piece about how America is in mourning now in the middle of a pandemic, the accompanying pandemic economy, the cry for some sense of social justice and a racial reckoning, all of those keynotes. Well, the Lincoln Project in early October released 2 ads, early to mid-October, called the MAGA Church, right? And so they look at the preachers and teachers who have enabled the current president, right? I think that's their message. And they show the fire and brimstone, and in some cases linking Donald Trump as having been sent by God, right, almost like a son of God. Now that's a claim, because I also teach international relations and some other things at a local university back home in Connecticut. That's a claim that you typically hear from the monarchical past, like Europe, right, like Russia, right before the 1917 revolution, where Tsar Nicholas viewed himself as both, yes, I am your ruler, oh, and by the way, I'm handpicked by God, right, so I'm divine. So pray to me and obey me, right? So the pray and obey feature, right? There's an echo of that, I think, in some of the well done, and I'm not judging it, but they're well produced, Lincoln ads, right? The MAGA Church. There's another one on the MAGA Church as well, right, with the president claiming maybe it's a gift from God, and these aren't casual references. They're almost explicit. So the language is pulled in. Now, Joe Biden is taking, former vice president certainly is taking a hit, right, in evangelical circles and even conservative Christian circles and conservative other circles, non-Christian as well, right, for his views, for example, on reproductive rights, right. And so he ran a series, I think, in mid-October, a trifecta of faith-based ads showing how important his faith, he's always carrying a rosary, and how important his faith, how central it is, right?
His sons, right?
Right. Well, it got him through, death of a wife and a child, and death of a second child, and if those aren't challenges enough, I can't imagine what could be more on a personal level, regardless of who you are, including the President of the United States.
And it's when we often turn to religion just in our daily life.
Yes, we do, because, that's another question, but I think we always ask why. And if we struggle with and have a path that we've adopted, then we go down that path, right? Reform Jewish, ultra-Orthodox, Baha'i, some derivation of Buddhism, right? Certainly some denomination within Christianity or non-denomination within Christianity. We go down that path to answer the question why and the question of significance, right? And the deeper question, which I think is not, will I be forgotten, right? So even, I would tend to argue, an atheist at points in time before they leave this earth in the middle of a political campaign, for example, or they may be political, wants to know that they made a difference, right? And they'll be remembered. And I think that's a deeper impulse and separate conversation. But let's get back to the current 2020 campaign. Yeah, for sure. So I think Joe Biden is trying to at least appeal to those independent-minded Catholic voters, certainly in Pennsylvania, old white established Catholic voters, and the new, certainly younger Latinx and Hispanic communities in Florida, right, becoming more cosmopolitan each day, right, and so I think he's trying to reach those. The question is, will people tend to become one-issue voters, or will they make that's an issue they'll hold on to, I believe, at life and conception, but still go in the voting booth and perhaps be persuaded but that's a private issue. Biden is not attacking the Catholic Church. What he's saying is that from where I sit, my Catholicism, my faith is important. It's just that his line has been for years, I choose not to impose it on others, right? And he's been criticized for, okay, don't impose it, but practice it. And when you come to a fork in the road sometimes, right, on reproductive rights, you do have to choose publicly. And so that's always going to be the tension there. So I think he's trying to at least present himself as a man of faith, right? MAGA churches and the Republicans running the Lincoln Project, who've done the MAGA church ads, are attacking Donald Trump as somebody who is simply using faith and could care less about faith and God, but is using God and faith simply as a political tool in his toolbox, right? As a wedge issue, right? And certainly the Trump campaign would tell you those are, I suspect, both untrue, and I'm being polite here, that real people of faith do want a president, and they may not judge that president's personal or moral behavior, but they at least want a president who will protect their rights of religion. And we can go a number of different directions, including cases that might come up before the Supreme Court. For example, people say, well, how is religious freedom under attack in America? Well, for example, if you're an employer like Hobby Lobby, do you have a right to bring your personal faith, if you're the founder of a company, into the workplace, right? And in the case of Hobby Lobby, I think the question is, can they deny not providing medical support for contraceptive devices, right? Right. So you see where this is going, right? The famous cake case, right? I think it was in Texas, right? Does a baker have the right? I'm not going to judge, but this is what the court's confronted with. So yes, very much so, people will seek, under this president at least, currently, cover or protection in law of religious liberty, the right to deny, right? I'm a baker, and I have the right to deny making a wedding cake for an LBGT couple, right? And so these are very serious issues and questions that cut to the core right now of who we are.
In many ways, I have to say, with what we've seen, what we've heard throughout this election campaign, is I don't think we've ever had a time where we've heard so much about conspiracy theories on such a profound and sublime level that it's actually part of the campaign rhetoric, part of the journalistic questioning that we have to ask where somebody stands on something as bizarrely subversive as QAnon.
Right. Well, and no, because most presidential candidates on the left and the right realize that at the end of the day, you try to appeal to the center, right? I mean, most presidential elections typically will have a significant, and I'm not a pollster by trade, just my hunch, you and me here in the room together, right? I have a significant number of undecideds that pretty much are there until election day, right? Or the election is over on election day, November 3rd. That's not the case now. People have already chosen sides. So now it's a question of rallying your base, right? Because people have already decided who they're going to go for, right? And we've heard the pundits talk endlessly, right? People who know much better than we do, who live this, right? On the major networks, on social media, and it almost gets tiring and numbing, right, to see these Zoom sessions on Fox News or CNN or the BBC or, MSNBC. I don't care, left, right, in between, national, domestic. Everybody is there with their own box, like Hollywood Squares, giving their opinion. It gets tiring, right? But yeah, for sure, in this campaign, more so than others, religion is being used to rally the base, which means that if you were trying to court voters and convince them, you don't shout at them, right? You persuade them. And that's what your messaging is, right? Negative ads do work, but I have to believe there are ways to create a negative ad, a negative light version, and a negative hard version, right? So I think that's where we are in this campaign.
Let's talk about QAnon.
So in the case of QAnon, right, I mean, some people who are suspicious of news from everywhere with this information gap will show up at church and pray, and maybe a conservative free will kind of a Congregationalist tradition, the Protestant Christian tradition. But then they're starting to get news in the political season from QAnon. They'll say, well, but you know what? Maybe there's something here about the elites in Hollywood. Maybe there's something here about the elites who tend to be left of center in Washington. Maybe the two talk to each other. And maybe from a spiritual perspective, there really is going to be some kind of end of days struggle. And I need to put myself on a side in terms of who I support politically. And that's where the Trump message comes in, according to QAnon, that President Trump will, once he's reelected, arrest the pedophiles and the elites in Hollywood and in Washington. There may be or may not be a trial. He may even authorize some executions. We can dismiss that, but don't. Because people who hear that message that have no other source, because they've consciously given up other sources, for whatever reason, and taken it and endowed it with a religious a gloss, take it very seriously. And that's a problem.
Well, let's talk about our journey down to D.C. It's coming up. We're going to be talking to religious leaders, political leaders, fellow journalists. What's in front of us?
I think what we talked about is pretty much sticking a mic in front of somebody if they'll talk to us, making sure that they're safe, and shutting up and letting them talk. So we started with the timeless questions, which are deceptively simple, right? Are you political? Are you religious? And do the two mix, right? Don't judge it. This is for a series on politics and religion in America. And let them talk. And I think what people will tell you, regardless of race, color, creed, I suspect regardless of income, regardless of what they are doing for a living, including unemployed, desperately trying to make ends meet and find a job, right? That the people are eloquent. There is, I think, a level of profound wisdom that we just don't get anymore. And I think we did that. And we're going to do that in Washington. So in addition to doing some stand-up, sit-down interviews, ideally with people who can speak to questions of faith on both the left and the right, from the Republican and Democratic points of view, along with what we think will be a great interview with a very respected insider publication like no other, The Hill. I think we'll be able to flesh out some hot issues, right, beyond what the networks are talking about right now, right? Let them talk about what they're going to talk about. But religion and politics was there well before the 2020 election, and it's going to be there well after. It's just hot right now.
And aside from continuing this series of talking to people in the street, as it were, regular members of the public, we're also going to do some professional interviews with various leaders, right?
Right. The 2020 election piece we're putting together in Washington next week is really, hopefully, just really 3 or 4 short interviews and some person in the street interviews, right? I mean, it's a faith-based person from the Republican side, from the Democratic side, a reporter with an insider who works for the ultimate insider publication, The Hill, right? And then some personal person in street interviews, right? Wherever we can grab them. That's the 2020 election edition, right? That we're certainly putting out through available channels, Foreign Press Association, networks, social media, whoever is interested, right? The other part, and we'll use those, would be other interviews with religious leaders in Washington, which will be part of a wider series called Discern. And Discern is really the umbrella, right, for religion and politics, all things religion and politics. So that's where we would place our Riding the Rails 3 questions for America. And then there's a deeper piece. Think of it sort of as the Meet the Press, which is my model, Meet the Press version, but on the religious dimension of a political question of the day. Right? So you can have policymakers at the federal level, right? Senate, House, and from the White House, and other influencers in the global capital and our nation's capital, Washington, stepping on the set, right, to do sit-downs and deep dives on their thinking. So this is part of discern, the ability to discern, if we can, the difference between religion and politics, and that timeless question of when they do mix and we can't deny it, or we try to deny it and it ain't going to work because it's there. And we use coded language for it, because I really think that for us to deny it and create almost the false impression that the two do not talk to each other is, to be frank, silly.
Well, Lew, as you know, Unprecedented Journey really is all about that journey, that personal journey. So again, I want to shift it back to you. Why this journey? Why this commitment to go down to DC, this commitment to talk to leaders and the public about politics and religion? Why now?
One word, death, right? I'm at the end of my earthly life. I mean, I'm not trying to be morose and so forth. But I've had a good life, a fairly long life, a lucky life, a blessed life, right? I mean, I have a roof over my head, a faithful partner, a wife and spouse of over 40 years. Life doesn't always work out the way you want, right? So for me, journalism, and I do have a communications degree from the 70s, which is journalism degree.
Yeah, well, that was a grander time back then, especially I want to throw it all the way back to Edward R. Murrow, when it was more about presenting the news and not so much about big personalities.
Yeah, right. Well, I had one of those, and it was taught by women and men, old school, right? I mean, Scripps Howard photographers and writers, where you edited your own copy and were under deadline, didn't make a lot of money. There weren't the shows, right? And the obscene amount of money that we throw hosts, right? You did a job, and if you did well enough, you could earn a decent living, but then, you know, your time ended. So for me, journalism offers, putting that degree to work 40 some years after I got it, better late than never, an avenue to tell a story. Journalism is about telling a story, and it's not telling, it's being able to quickly and insightfully and deeply capture a story in about 10 seconds, right? I mean, you know, right, I'm thinking deadline, right? But I think that's why we partnered, because this is about telling a story that people really aren't telling right now, right? I mean, it's happening right now. Religion and politics is there, and we need to figure out what it means and what it is. So this offers an avenue to tell that story.
Well, all I can say to that is amen, brother. Amen. But I really do look forward to our journey down to DC, to exploring these topics, these conversations of religion and politics at the 2020 election at the ballot box. And I'm sure we're going to learn a lot and be able to share a lot with everybody who tunes in. So Lew, again, I want to thank you for being here today. It really means a lot. Love getting in the sandbox and having these deep dish conversations about two very, very tenuous issues, politics and religion. So thank you again for being here.
Great, thanks for having me.
And I hope you'll join us on that journey, because I'll be posting a lot of the shows here on this channel for you to enjoy and explore with us. We'll be getting information and sharing that with you, hopefully without any of the rhetoric, any of the noise, just information, up close and personal interviews with political leaders, religious leaders. How unprecedented is that for a change? And indeed, this is a very unprecedented time and an unprecedented election, to be sure. So I hope you'll join us. Stay tuned for more. And until then, I'm Jeff Oppenheim for Unprecedented Journey. Stay safe, stay well, and stay informed.